also want to say thank you to the Rise for hosting us tonight. And I feel really blessed and honoured to be here with such awesome activists and land workers and fellow sustainable kind of movement lovers. So yes, my name is Tasha, and I'm from 42 Acres, and in many senses I'm the kind of production manager, but as you'll find out later on, it's not a production manager in a typical sense. So tonight we're going to talk about rewilding and agri-wilding, so where perhaps food production meets the rewilding movement. And we have Ben Goldsmith here, who has a farm in Somerset, which is next to 42 Acres, and where you're exploring the rewilding model, and you're also an advocate for the rewilding movement in general. And then we're going to move on to Hal, who, as you heard, is working with the Gaia Foundation. He is also the European coordinator of the Yes to Life and No to Mining movement, as well as working with Snow Change in Finland on a large-scale rewilding project. So we have the kind of the local and the global. And then we're going to move on to talking about 42 Acres and the rewilding that we're doing there, and also the agri-wilding side and the food production, and how we're kind of playing and learning about the land and food production. So I'm going to pass over to Ben, who's going to start.
Thank you very much. With that little meditation, I've completely forgotten everything I was going to say. So let's regroup. I think I've been asked to come and talk partly because I'm doing some rewilding and making some interesting things happen on my farm nearby, next to these folks here in the Frome Valley, and also because I am somehow on the board of DEFRA. So I'm still not quite sure how it happened, but I'm a lucky infiltrator and have managed to make my way into that great monolithic government department where I advocate and hustle relentlessly for nature, which is my passion, and which we'll talk about. But I feel very lucky to be here, and I feel lucky to be in Frome. Frome it's kind of different from everywhere else that I know. You know, I walk down the little streets to get here, and people have got compost in their front gardens, and there's some Swift boxes on the other side of this wall up here, and there's a real kind of sensitivity to nature and local food production here, and I think it's a really tremendously interesting place. And it's particularly interesting because it's one of the first and only towns in England to have wild, free-living beavers. And I don't know how many people know this, but there are a thriving and growing population of beavers on the Somerset Frome, Somerset Avon River, leading all the way up to Avonmouth in Bristol. And there are families of beavers breeding kind of within yards of us. And I think that is something that is so perfect for Frome, because beavers are emblematic of nature recovery. The more you learn about beavers, the more you become obsessed with them, the more you realise that they are it's as if the term keystone species was invented to describe beavers. I didn't even 15 or 18 years ago, when I first started advocating for beaver reintroduction, didn't even know they were native to Europe. I thought of beavers as a Canadian, North American animal, but Europe has its own species of beaver, the Eurasian beaver, which once stretched from Britain, France, Spain, all the way as far as Mongolia. Probably 400 million beavers at one stage, reduced to less than 5,000 in 1900. Our ancestors worshipped beavers. They understood the importance of beavers. It was a grave crime to harm a beaver or its habitat in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, Iran. The other side of the Atlantic, Native American Indians also revered beavers. They called them little people, because they knew that the engineering that beavers do on the small creeks and streams holds water back in the landscape in a way that no other species except for us is able to do. So when beavers return to a river system, they quite literally breathe life back into that landscape. And in the process, they help prevent flash flooding, they help prevent drought, and so on. So I think it's emblematic of the part of England we're in, that this is the epicenter of of beaver recovery 600 years after the last beavers were extirpated from Britain. And it wasn't just beavers. I mean, we've lost so much in this country. You know, this is one of the most nature-depleted places on the planet. The IUCN produces an index every few years of which countries are the most nature-depleted in the world, and there we are at the bottom, you know, kind of 10 off the bottom, alongside Kuwait and Malta, and you know, places that really have lost so much of their nature. And people don't really realise it. You know, people fly into Gatwick from their summer holiday and they see the rolling green landscape beneath them, not realising that much of it is, well, it's kind of green concrete, really. And they don't realise that we've lost countless species. You know, I'm a nature enthusiast, and I didn't know that beavers and lynx and some of these animals used to live all over Britain. There's a term that people may or may not know, which is the term shifting baselines. You know, as we grow older, we see the depletion taking place around us. We no longer hear a cuckoo in the summer we used to hear when we were younger, or fewer and fewer house martins return in the spring to nest under the eaves of our parents' house. And we yearn for things to be how they were when we were young. But we don't realise that when we were young, they were already pretty trashed as compared to when our parents were young. And when our parents were young, there was a lot gone from when their parents were young. And so with each passing generation, our expectations diminish, such that we've become satisfied with a landscape that is very depleted. And I think something has changed in the last 2 or 3 years in the British psyche. In fact, I think in the psyche of the world, I think people are starting to realise what's been lost. You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote of this great apparition that shines so peacefully all around us. You know, that's how he described nature. He was a pastor who found God in nature and really kind of forged a new transcendental Christianity in kind of mid-19th century America. And I think that something of Ralph Waldo Emerson's way of looking at things has taken root, certainly amongst the people I know in this country in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think the lockdown, particularly the first COVID lockdown that seemed to go on forever, you know, I think changed something, because people were forced to stay in their place, and all there was to do was explore local nature. And people discovered where the wildflowers are. You know, they discovered, you know, what it sounds like, the bird song, when the traffic is quieted. You know, we saw road verges riotous with wildflowers, first time they hadn't been mown in the spring in forever. And I think a sort of reconnection took place, and an awakening that healthy, abundant, diverse nature is absolutely central, fundamental to our physical and our spiritual health. And I think that feeling has stayed with us, and there is now a clamour for nature recovery. You read the Telegraph, you know, the Telegraph, which is the paper read by landowners and, you know, Tory politicians. You know, Telegraph is full of rewilding stories every single day. The beaver stories and smooth snakes being reintroduced on the south coast, and white storks breeding in Sussex for the first time in 500 years, and, you know, Toff's rewilding estates in Dublin, and every single day, from the Guardian to the Telegraph, there is a demand from the readers for stories of nature recovery. And with that, there's a realisation of quite how far we've got to travel to bring nature back to anything like that which our ancestors knew several hundred years ago. And I think it kind of boils down to two things have gone wrong. Many things have gone wrong, but two fundamental practical things have gone wrong. The first is the loss of the keystone species. And there's a growing understanding amongst ecologists generally that ecosystems rely on these handful of species which have a disproportionate impact in their environment. A bit like a medieval bridge. The architect built a bridge with several arches, and every brick and stone in that bridge has a role to play, but the keystone at the bottom of the arch is integral. If you pull that out, the arch collapses. It was an architectural trick so that retreating armies could destroy the bridges in their wake. And with the removal of the keystones, we've seen ecosystem collapse. And as far as I can make out, there were really 4 keystones that were lost in Britain, particularly upland Britain. You know, wilderness survived in Britain long after the Romans, long after the rise of intensive agriculture. In the Highlands of Scotland, the uplands of central Wales, and the wilds north of Hadrian's Wall in England, there was still proper wilderness in the 1700s. And with the clearances that took place and the replacement of traditional upland tribal society with mostly English-owned, or certainly English-aligned, intensive sheep ranches, the ecosystem collapsed. And those four keystones were and are the native cattle. So the Highland people of Wales, of England and Scotland all had native cattle. Sheep were a rarity. There were fewer than 500,000 sheep in Britain, even in 1850. 35 million today. The cattle are essential for preventing the landscape from closing over and becoming a dark, closed forest. We fetishize closed canopy forest in this country. We call it ancient woodland. And yes, it's beautiful, and those carpets of bluebells are beautiful, but it's not nearly as diverse as we're led to believe. In fact, all of the iconic species in this country, you open a children's book, the things you look at, the colourful toadstools, the edible mushrooms, the hedgehogs, the songbirds, the wildflowers, the blackberries, the crabapple trees, they all thrive in sunlight, which points to a past in which the country was blanketed in a kind of semi-open woodland mosaic. Well, it's the cattle that engineer that woodland mosaic, a bit like the New Forest today. In the absence of cattle, you get closed forest. So the cattle is the essential engineer of the European, British open or semi-open woodland ecosystem. The wild boar also disappeared around the time of the clearances. The wild boar disappeared in the 1750s, 1780s, that sort of time. And the wild boar is nature's gardener, and it's another keystone species. A surprisingly large number of British plant species rely on wild boar for the germination of their seeds, because the wild boar turns over the grass and exposes the soil. And there's an amazing little clip on YouTube. It's some drone footage in northern France of a family of wild boar furrowing the ground in different directions, forming a kind of hand. Each boar is ploughing along what looks like a finger. And then the drone comes back in the spring, and each finger is full of colour. And they've quite literally painted colour through the landscape. Poppies and cornflowers and scarlet pimpernel and black poplar and aspen are two trees that need the activities of wild boar. The robin only comes to us as we dig our garden because it learnt from the wild boar that where gardening takes place, insects and worms are exposed. So the wild boar is an essential gardener of the ecosystem. The beaver for holding water back in the landscape, and the wolf for regulating the numbers of all the rest. All of these species disappeared from upland Britain between about 1730 and 1830. The cattle went with the people, who were mostly shipped to Canada or the West Indies, North America. So putting back keystone species is not just about putting pretty animals back into the landscape. It's lovely to see a beaver behind Asda in Frome, but actually there's an essential role being played by that species, and life pours in behind these keystones if you put them back. So I think there is also a symbolic process whereby we learn to live with these creatures. Beavers make a terrible mess. They, alongside the water, they make a mess. They chop down willows and they create untidiness. And we are particularly bad at fetishizing tidiness in this country and wanting to control every square inch. And it's like a drug, and beavers wean us off that drug. And I think that learning to live in harmony and coexistence with some of these species, however much of a nuisance they might be, is I think absolutely symbolic of the journey we need to go on as a society if we're to find harmony with nature. If we're to find a way frictionlessly to integrate our own human systems into natural ones, which has to be the essential task of our time. The alternative is not worth thinking about. So I think the other problem is more recent, and that is an attempt to farm intensively every square inch of the country. There's nowhere else like it. You go to the uplands of northern Spain, you go to Cantabria or Asturias, and those communities have got diverse economic activities going on. We've got a B&B, and maybe there's a graphic designer with some new high-speed broadband living in one of these villages, and they've got some extensive cattle, and they do a little bit of light forestry and maybe some beekeeping, and they're very, very diverse economies. What we have is intensive farming in every square inch, no matter how suitable. And that's because we've become very good at milking subsidies out of the European Union. And I think, I know virtually no one who, I'm afraid, like me, voted Leave. I'm surrounded by very passionate Remainers. There's one thing we can all agree on, whether we voted Leave or Remain, and that is leaving the Common Agricultural Policy was really a gift, because it gave us the opportunity to reimagine how public money is distributed in the countryside. And thankfully, someone with really someone, I mean, love him or hate him, but someone with the heft and the intellectual depth of Michael Gove, who said, what we're going to do is public money for public good. So the budget, £2.5 billion a year of farm subsidies, is going to transition over 7 years into a system whereby farmers are directly rewarded for delivering public goods, helping to reduce flooding, helping to rebuild soil, helping to protect cherished landscapes, helping to rebuild biodiversity, providing public access, whatever. There's a menu of things that farmers can do for which they will be rewarded by the taxpayer. And the subsidies are ending. So sheep ranching in the Lake District, 3,000 sheep per farm, rounded up by quad bikes, is simply not economically viable. And it is the cause of all sorts of public bads. Terrible flooding. The town of Keswick is underwater every single year, directly as a result of overgrazing in the hills of the Lake District. It rains all winter, and then you get a hosepipe ban because the hills, which are nature's water towers, are simply unable to hold back water because they're so overgrazed by sheep. So under the new scheme, which I think is the biggest win for nature we've ever seen in this country, much bigger than anyone quite realizes, I think we're going to see massive change. And I think it will fall into two categories. Now, I think in the really good land, the 20 or so % of Britain that produces 85% of the food, the eastern part of Britain, Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, these places, I think we're going to see a tremendous shift towards productive, regenerative farming. I think farmers are going to learn to combine the best of ancient wisdom, rotational practices, studying the effects of the moon on plant cycles, with the best of modern technology, integrated pest management, the combination of satellites with drones and soil sensors. I think that no-till, planting without ploughing. I think we're going to find that with a system of subsidies that directly rewards these risk-taking moves, these innovations, I think we're going to find the rise of a whole new breed of super intensive but very productive, very regenerative, restorative farming in our best agricultural landscapes. And I think across much of the rest of Britain, we're going to find a transition back to a medieval style of wilder farming, because it won't pay to try and flog that dead horse any longer and try and produce as much as you can off it with ever-increasing herds of sheep, flocks of sheep, or whatever it might be. So on the kind of grade 5 farmland that I have in the Brougham Valley, I think we'll go back to the days of Selwood, in which farmers run relatively modest numbers of native cattle extensively through a landscape that drifts back towards open wood pasture. And I think that new economic models will arise across great swathes of Britain. And Rewilding Britain talks about a target of, let's rewild 5% of Britain. Well, I think it'll look more like 50 or 60% of Britain. I don't think it's 5%. I don't think intensive farming will work economically. You simply won't be able to do it anymore without subsidy. And I think that farmers are going to be at the center of that transition, because without the cattle, we'll have a tangle of dark forest, which is not particularly useful for nature or anything. So I think the new scheme is going to be transformational, and farmers will drift quite quickly back to how their great-great-great-grandparents farmed, which is native cattle. And I think the number of sheep will drop dramatically. I don't know whether I was going to talk briefly about food security. I think food security is a really worthy goal. I think it's great that we should aim to feed ourselves. I don't think transitions to wilder farming on great stretches of our landscape is a threat to food security, because those farmers will still be producing food. Less of it, maybe 50% less of it, but they'll still be producing beef, there'll still be venison, there'll still be nuts and other things appearing off that landscape. It won't be a landscape that doesn't produce food anymore. And in the meantime, I think we'll start to look at things like food waste. 50% of the food we produce in this country is wasted. If we're interested in food security, well, let's tackle food waste. 3 million tons of good food is stuffed into the throats of factory farmed animals every year in this country. Well, if we're interested in food security, let's feed that to human beings and not try to convert it at a terrible conversion rate into factory farmed animal meat. And then, of course, tens of thousands of our best acres used to grow food for bioenergy reactors and vehicles, biofuels and so on. Well, if we're interested in food security, that's got to stop. So I think tackling those things before we start worrying about nature recovery in the context of food security. So I thought I'd just finish with just briefly telling you what I'm doing in my place next to Seth and these folks. I've taken all the grazing animals off and ripped out 10 skip loads of barbed wire fencing. We did it in the lockdown. We removed one fence and then find the old one behind it. Then we ripped that one out and there was an even older one behind that. So we've ripped out fencing, we've re-wiggled our artificially straightened streams and culverts and created more of a wetland along our valley bottom. And now we're just letting the land effectively go to rack and ruin. Nettles and docks and dog rose and hawthorn and blackthorn popping up through the middle of the fields, and great numbers of goldfinches kind of scattering from one patch of thistle to the next. And it's coming to life in a way that I couldn't possibly have imagined. After 3 or 4 years, we will bring in a herd of longhorn cattle, and we'll grow that over a period of time, and we will then be farming again, just in a much more ancient way. And I hope that way of doing things, incentivized by the new scheme emanating from DEFRA, will mean that much of Selwood Forest, a landscape which stretches from Bath all the way to Frome and out towards Wells, will go back to being how it was in the 1840s, 1850s. If you look at the old tithe maps, there weren't fields in this part of Somerset. This was a bit like the New Forest. It was a great wood pasture. And all of these towns that we live in were really cattle farming towns that turned out their cattle, turned out their pigs, and brought them back in. A bit like the Spanish dehesas of Andalusia. And so there is a new initiative called Wilder Selwood. Simon Nash, who used to run the Somerset Wildlife Trust, is coordinating that. And he spends his time like a sort of Victorian parson in his car, meeting one farmer after the next and persuading them to drift in the direction of wilder farming on part of their land, along a river corridor, or on all of their land. And it's happening, and soon the incentives will be there. So I hope that we sitting here will find that we were at the epicenter of this landscape change. So I think I've waffled on enough. But thank you all very much for hearing me out.
Thank you, Ben. I was sat here thinking, you're giving me food for thought, but you're actually giving me thought for food. So I'm going to hand over to Hal, who's going to talk to us about snow change in Finland, and if you want to talk to us about the other projects you're involved in. Hal and I met a couple of years ago very briefly and talked quite passionately about wild food. And just before when we were talking, just before we came on, he was also talking to me about how one of the projects he's working with, how the relationship between the rewilding and then actually working with using some of the foods from the land. So I'd be really interested in hearing about that.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Ben. That was fascinating, and thank you for having me. As Warren said at the start, I work at the Gaia Foundation, but the way we work is a very networked way. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the projects that I'm involved with our global partners. One is quite close to home in Wales, the part that Ben was talking about near the Brecon Beacons, and also I'm going to start by talking about an organisation called Snow Change, which is based in eastern Finland, in Karelia, and Karelia is split between what's now Russia and what is Finland. It's a border that's long fluctuated between different empires. Some of you may not know, but Finland was only made a country in 1917, and farming is a relatively recent thing in that country. If you look at soil sampling and sampling from river sediments, farming at any scale, in Karelia at least, has only really been happening for the last 500 years, whereas in Europe it's obviously for thousands of years, the rest of Europe. So we're talking about an area which is the boreal, basically, and largely it's peat mires, marsh mires, wetland areas, lakes. There's over 188,000 lakes in Finland, and forests. And what's really made the difference there is very different history here, and the serious, massive degradation of land that's happened there is more recent as well. Largely, it's been done since World War II, when after that war ended as a penalty for being on the wrong side, which was, of course, the wrong side. Finland was forced to pay a massive war reparation to Russia, who they fought tooth and nail against to protect their border in the north. And in order to pay back that war reparation, they essentially mined and forested all of that wildland in the boreal. Well over 60% has been converted. It's largely been converted for industrial forestry and for the extraction of peat, which is an incredibly potent fossil fuel. Doesn't get the same coverage or media as coal, but it's incredibly potent when it's released into the atmosphere. Largely burnt for, in the old days, on the small scale for households, but now for powering the country. And so that brings us up to the modern day. And about 10 years ago, the community of Selkie, where the Snow Change Cooperative is based, the fishermen woke up in the morning, went down to the river as they usually do, to find the whole river full of fish belly up. And a local peat mine had suffered an acidic leak, which is fairly typical, into the river, and it had killed all the fish. That catalysed the campaign, and through that campaign they became the first community in Finland to get the peat mine shut down. And as someone who works with mining affected communities, that's a massive victory. But when you win that victory, what happens next? And that becomes the huge question. And since that time, they've been on a remarkable journey. When they went to the site after mining had stopped initially, before anything had been done, there was only 3 bird species visible and pretty much nothing else. And we're talking about an area of the world which still has a lot of these keystone species. And so they started what is a very extraordinary community-led rewilding project that, as I'll say later on, has been expanded massively to the rest of Finland. And over the last 7 or 8 years, first of all, what they did is they re-wetted it. So they poured water back into the peat mine. And what that does is it immediately stops the emission of carbon. It doesn't mean that it becomes a carbon sink immediately, but it stops that carbon leaving. And today, if you go there, I mean, you wouldn't think it had ever been a mine. In a very short period of time, demonstrating nature's unbelievable resilience and bounce back ability, that place now has 195 bird species. Is an absolutely critical stop off on the European flyway by which birds migrate up to Siberia. They have thousands and thousands of geese stopping over. They have wonderful swans. They have lots of nesting, extremely rare birds. Fish are back in the river, and there are indicators of extremely high quality water, like brook lamprey, which have been spied back in the rivers. And throughout the whole catchment area around this mine, as well as restoring that, they've created new wetland areas or recreated them where they've been destroyed by forestry. And what that's done is it's dramatically reduced the loading of heavy metals into the lake systems further downriver, and created obviously new habitats and healthier habitats for the fish that they rely on as fisher people. They also use the marsh mires for hay gathering, for berry gathering, and they're really, and for hunting as well, so fowling for wild duck, and also it's often as an open area within forests, so it's a good area for them to hunt mammals also. And so it's a remarkable recovery, but what's even more remarkable, I think, is how they achieved it. Now, a lot of rewilding projects, as some of you may know, run into a lot of controversy around how they impact local people's livelihoods. That is to some extent mitigated in Finland by the fact that not many people are doing large-scale agriculture, especially not in these areas, and they're not farming sheep or anything like that, certainly. So that's one benefit, but still, you have all of these actors around the table who have to agree to a vision or not agree. But what they decided to do was to do it all through a consensus-based, community-led initiative which valued indigenous knowledge and knowledge on the land as highly as it valued the scientific and technical knowledge that would need to be brought in to help restore these areas. So what they did is they created a co-management council, which involved the community members, the hunting and fishing associations, the people who were actively gathering on the land, and they're referred to as their sensors, who are out there 365 days a year, experiencing what's going on, noticing what's going wrong, down to these minute details like in the winter, because of the freeze thaw caused by climate change, hares now, they have these huge paws which allow them to run over the snow extremely quickly, more quickly than Arctic foxes. And now there's these layers in the snow which allow the foxes to run more quickly over the snow, so you're seeing a drop-off in hare populations. Now, it's very unlikely that those things are spotted as quickly by fly-in, fly-out scientists, but the people who are there every day will see it. So they brought this knowledge into the project, and everything that they do is not only about bringing that knowledge to bear to restore those ecosystems, but it's also about eventually handing over those ecosystems or bringing those ecosystems back into use by the communities. So what they've tried to do through this is to break down this terrible European perspective in which use and wildness and richness are set as opposites, which is that view is as rife in the conservation sector as it is in big business. And so to break that down, they've taken forward the project as a collective from day one. And they have a model, which is that those sites, once they've been rewilded, will return and they'll become what's known as an indigenous and community conserved area. So they'll remain in the community, pass into their control when they no longer need the scientific expertise, and they will be the people who govern that land, the people who use that land. And the faith is with them, as it should be, that they're the best people, the best custodians of those places, and they've gone through a tremendous learning experience being back on the land or re-engaging with it in a new way to get there. And this approach has been so successful there that it's now expanded from this small marsh mire, this relatively small river system, to more than 26,000 hectares across the entirety of Finland. So all the way from the Arctic north in Sami territories, where they've been rewilding river systems and forests, to the east and to the west in the archipelago, which goes across into Sweden, and in the centre of the country where you have some of the largest intact boreal marsh mires remaining. And that is a big number. I mean, a hectare is about a football pitch, so if you can imagine the scale of that, strategically placed, especially along river systems, it's a tremendous amount of work that they've been able to do. And by placing communities at the heart, they also have the sustainability built in from the beginning. So it's obviously an amazing story. We've been involved in that, but we've also been curious about how we can replicate that, or at least learn from that and take it to other places, including the UK. So I just want to say a little bit about a project in Wales, where we've been, it's on an estate called the Penpont Estate. And they have an ambition to rewild their land, but they want to do it with everybody still there. So that's the people who own the land, the tenant farmers, the craftspeople who work on the land and take timber out of the forest, people who do the forestry. And rather than saying, actually, as some people have done in other parts of the world, well, you're unhelpful, you need to leave, rather to say, we can all be part of this, but we have to build the vision together. And so what we've been doing is we've been adopting some of the tools used by Snow Change, including oral histories from elders in the community who know the land best, and then also some tools that we use in our work with global partners. So participatory mapping, where we map the past to get past these shifting baselines, to use multiple forms of evidence, from testimony from elders to scientific data to tide maps and other things that Ben spoke about, to build up a much more realistic baseline and a social baseline. And then we look at the present, which is usually a picture of disorder by comparison, a picture of loss, something that really hits everybody around the table, no matter who they are and no matter what responsibility that they might bear for that. And then we map the future, we map how we want it to be, and on that map we build our consensus for our ambition together, and we put down a vision that everybody has agreed to, and that we can then work towards, in the classic kind of like strategic planned way that you have to do, where you're deciding what to leave wild and what to let go, as Ben described. So we've been pursuing that, and we're very excited about how that project's been going, and we're hopeful that a Snow Change style, co-management style rewilding kind of fold in the Penpont Estate it's obviously an extremely different context, one that is racked by the damage that's been done by industrial farming and land clearances, the severing of people's connections with land, which has happened, I would say, much more severely in this country. So perhaps we're coming back from further away, but I think with the right tools and the right determination and the right zeitgeist, as Ben referred to, I think that we can make a good fist of it, and we all must hope that we can. So thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you about your wild tending.
I'm also going to point out, you've got awesome shoes on, very nice shoes. So Seth's going to tell us a bit about 42 acres and the vision, and the kind of mixture really that we're exploring with Agri-Rewilding. And then I will probably drill down a little bit more into the peasant perspective as that's my thing. So I'll pass you over to Seth.
So when I hear the words about we feed the world and how we feed the world, for me what comes to mind is not only feeding us, but also feeding all living beings on this planet. That means the soil, the animals, the plants, the fungi, as well as us as human beings and animals. At 42 Acres we talk about Agri-Rewilding, and that for us is this bridge between regenerative agriculture and rewilding. In some ways they're at two ends of the spectrum where one of the biggest issues in the world that we have is our food system, which is kind of based on what I call the capitalist diet, where you can get food from anywhere, anytime. Doesn't really matter where it's grown, what time of year, and that is destroying our soil, it's destroying biodiversity, and it's destroying our human gut soil, our own health. We need to design a food system that supports life on Earth, that increases biodiversity through the food we grow, increases and improves our own health, our own gut health, as well as our own connection to this Earth. We once lived on this Earth. I mean, Ben spoke before about previous generations where the majority of people on this Earth were farmers. That percentage is now tiny in this country. I think it's less than 1%. And we have, as humans, have lost our connection to nature and to our food system. So really what we're trying to do at 42 Acres is what I would call an experiment. It's looking at how can we grow food in a way that enhances biodiversity, where it also encourages us as humans to connect more with nature, to go out and pick wild food. We try and serve about 5% of wild food in all of our meals. That means we get outside on a regular basis. We tune in to what's happening with the weather, the seasons, so that we have to keep looking and connecting with different parcels of land and really know the space that we're custodians of. As well as that, we also look and see what wants to grow on the land. I guess in the traditional farming model, whether it's slash and burn or just clearing huge areas of land and saying, I want to put corn there, I want to put grain there. We need to look and see, well, what's already growing here, what's thriving, and how can we support and enhance that? And experiment with new things, but in a way that's sensitive to the environment. An example of what we've done over the last year at 42 Acres is we've planted about 1 kilometre of edible hedges. Traditionally, when you'd plant a hedge, you'd put a nice mix of different species in there. And what we've experimented with is planting, I guess, monocultural lines in 100, 200 metre strips of things like sea buckthorn that Tasha can talk more about, but really to see, well, can we farm in a way that creates habitat for nature, but also is kind of semi-commercial. We have to harvest these things, and one of the big issues with food is that it's cheap, and wild food can't compete with monocultural food with big machinery. So we need to find ways to kind of catch up, as it were, as well as not selling into supermarkets and wholesale markets, but really connecting people directly with the food source. So when people come to the land, we really encourage them to learn about our food philosophy. We grow most of our food either on the land or we source from within 42 miles. For us, we really need to move towards a food system that is local and regenerative, and one that, as we increase the amount of food we're putting on the land, we're also increasing biodiversity. Another project we've started last year is we're planting about 500 nut trees across the land. Typically on a commercial farm, we might be able to plant maybe 3 or 4 times that. But we want to also leave space for the light to get in, for other species to grow, for Ben's cattle to roam across the fields and join the nut trees over time. But really our philosophy is based in reminding us that we're part of nature, that we need to feed ourselves, but we also need to feed all of the other beings that live there and depend on the food systems. So that's really what we're trying to do. I'll pass over to Tasha more to talk about some of the detail of what that is.
Thanks, Seth. I'm going to have to throw these out the window because Seth just said half of it. So we'll see how this goes. So I won't go into the details of it, but my lineage is I'm half Nicaraguan, and I come from a line of peasant farmers, and my grandfather is still peasant farming into his 90s and has a piece of land that's, I think, about 4 acres, and he employs 12 people on the 4 acres of land, making indigenous pat lunches. So he's been my hero and my inspiration. And I didn't really know that until I was older, that actually he was my main sole informant, I think. And so when I was about 21, I became very interested in low impact living and had spent some time in the Amazon and ended up at a community called Tinker's Bubble, which I don't know if anybody's heard of it, but it's a community in South Somerset, and it's fossil fuel free, largely. And they really were my baptism into, so I ended up living there and having a daughter there and having a very, very amazing time. And you take away your mobile phone and you take away your screen, and suddenly you're left staring at nature for a long time. And I feel deeply like, I don't really know how to describe in words what it means to know a piece of land in that way, and to always walk on it, and to milk cows every morning by hand, to light a fire every time you want a cup of tea, and to live in community and co-run a piece of land. Also, inadvertently, although Tinker's Bubble is not formally a rewilding project, if you manage a piece of land without fossil fuels, you essentially, by proxy, end up having a rewilding project. So I feel like, and that kind of links into what you were saying about ways of interacting with land that are low impact, but also able to harvest food and produce food on the land. And then I, meandered away from Tinker's Bubble and ended up running a business. I became really, really good at picking sea buckthorn, which is a wild berry. It's native to England. It's native to many countries, including Greece, Scotland. And it's got vitamin A, B, D, K, P, omega-3, 6, 7, and 9. And it's 20 times more vitamin C than an orange, weight for weight. So it's what we used to use for our vitamin C, as well as rose hips. And I just fell in love with harvesting. I fell in love with working with your hands. And having not grown up that way, I grew up on a council estate in London, so this isn't exactly learnt information. It's just being on the land and letting the land work on me, really, and being horribly rebellious and not wanting to get a job like everyone else. And so somehow ended up at 42 acres. And Seth had bought the sea buckthorn juice, I think, at a festival. And so when I was invited to 42 acres, I really came as a professional forager to begin with, with that hat on, although I had lived off-grid and milk cows, etc. And, found how the ecosystem was producing abundance. And, there were thousands of nettles, and there were mushrooms, there were hedgehog fungi and winter chanterelle that I'd never seen before. And there's Norway spruce that the Native Americans would eat in the winter to keep the vitamin C and to keep away scurvy. And there's carp in the lake that can be eaten, and there's freaking wild boar everywhere, and there's all of this food. And at the same time, I was really thinking about how we're hoping to have we're developing the other side of the site, and we really want to feed lots of people. And so what does it mean to be the custodians of the kind of the food production and of the rewilding relationship? What does that mean? And that was what I was sat with for probably an entire year. And then I got another year because of COVID, so I'm quite grateful for that as well. And really what's come out of it for me personally is nature is abundant. All food originated in the wild. So everything, we originated in the wild, and everything that we interact with has its origins in the wild. And what I'm interested in is really doing that dance between nature's ability to produce food for us, because nature is producing food all the time. Whether it's for insects, I'm watching some of the medicinal mushrooms we have at 42, and I see that insects come and nibble them, and then they grow back. So you can't see, actually, they get nibbled and then they grow back. And these are some of these mushrooms, they're called Gonoderma appellatum. They're the closest relative we have to the reishi mushroom, and they're being used by the insects within our ecosystem medicinally, in a similar way to the way we do. And so if I, as a forager, go and take all of those medicinal mushrooms, I'm then not allowing the insects to perhaps use those mushrooms. And these mushrooms take up to 6 years to grow. So, so what does that mean? And ultimately what I could start to hear was, well, what if we tried to grow our own wild food? So what if we started working with the native wild mushroom species and worked with a mycologist and tried to grow our own native strains of mushrooms? And so that was a project we started maybe 2 years ago now. And so we collected wild specimens. We worked with this amazing mycologist called Patrick Mallory, and who's based mainly in Bristol. And he came and isolated wild medicinal strains of both turkey tail or cloud mushroom and birch polypore, which both of them are, amazing for your immune system, anti-parasitic, antiviral, antimicrobial, and used, were the inspiration for many of the cancer drugs available and are now being used in some of the mainstream cancer treatments. And actually bred these mushrooms in a lab and then brought them back in commercial quantity back onto the site. But instead of growing them on sterilized substrates and in plastic bags and in an artificial environment, which is where most of our mushrooms are produced, actually then using a methodology that was developed in Japan that was used up to 2,000 years ago, which is log production, so outdoor log production and drilling them into logs. And one of them is definitely working. So we have our own native strains fruiting, found out about 2 weeks ago, and we now have hundreds of these medicinal mushrooms. we will have thousands and thousands, and we are then able to take this medicine, which is both curative and preventative, and actually then weave it back into the menu in very small amounts, so that we're helping to essentially prevent illness before it occurs. And I, having been very blessed to be on land for a long time in a way that a lot of people don't have in this country, nature is just there providing all of these medicines and all of this nutrition all of the time. And actually, this idea of the kind of rewilded landscape that we're not touching is in a way, is beautiful to want to give back to nature. And I think that a lot of us are called to give back, because we're trying to readdress a balance that has gone horribly awry. And I think it is important that we really think about the other species. But I also think it's important to think about how are we interacting for our own necessities in the landscape. Because if I'm helping to rewild, but all of my food is coming from China, then I'm actually being counterproductive to my mission. And when we eat food from the land, we essentially become the land. And that changes us in ways that I can't really begin to describe unless you go on that journey. And you start doing things that maybe are illogical, but make loads of sense because you're responding to what your intuitive knowing is. And so we're doing that with the mushrooms, but we're doing that with lots of other native species, playing with wild seed, because wheat is one type of seed that evolved, but actually there's thousands of seeds that we can eat. And they grow easily and abundantly and are really nutritious. So there's so many different foods that we've not explored in the food production system. We're extremely blessed to have, to have the possibility of bringing them into the menu, because we work with awesome chefs that accept my craziness, and people that are open, like Seth. And and I'm not saying it's the answer, but I think it's part of some of the answers. Thank you. So, we're going to go into the bit where, I don't know if any of you guys have any questions for anybody here. If you want to put your hand up if you have a question. And then these guys are going to swing round to you. Does he need a microphone?
Yeah, he does.
If you can pause for a moment, they're just going to give you a mic.
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing your very optimistic views on what might happen in this country. But there's just an elephant in the room which no one has been talking about, perhaps. David Attenborough goes on it a lot. The figure, 1750 was mentioned quite a lot. In 1750, there were 6 million of us living in the UK. By 2050, there are going to be 80 million of us living in the UK. And these lovely pictures around the room of people talking about feeding the world. How much can we rewild if we've got to feed 10 billion of us? It's a subject which is inconvenient, but it's behind a lot of what you're talking about.
So I think in a British context, I think if we are, I think food security is absolutely the right thing to be thinking about. I think we should produce as much as possible of the food we consume here in Britain. But the fact is, around 85% of all the calories we produce in this country come off 20% of the land. The other 80% of the land is producing a fraction, 15%. So theoretically, you could completely turn to nature, 85% of the land, 80-ish% of the land, without producing any food whatsoever on it, and you'd see a 15 to 20% decline in the amount of food we produce. Now, no one's advocating doing that. People are talking about wilder farming, whereby you de-intensify. So 3,000 sheep becomes 300 longhorn cattle. Food production on farms that are rewilding tends to drop about 50%. So you're talking about de-intensification on great swathes of the landscape that are simply not suitable for intensive farming, and which aren't making a dent in our food production, if you look at the hard maths. So my view is, if we're interested in food security, we should look at food waste. We should look at the amount of crops that get fed into factory farms to produce meat at a terrible conversion rate, calorie for calorie. We should look at food for biofuels and food for bioenergy reactors, tens of thousands of our best acres. We should look at things like vertical farming and the production of lettuces in some of these vertical farming infrastructures. I think is quite an interesting and inevitable transition that's taking place. Things like precision fermentation, I think, is also quite interesting. And I just don't buy the idea that nature recovery is going to have a negative impact on the volume of food we produce. And then there's a question of the long-term sustainability of our ability to produce food at all. I mean, we're losing somewhere around 1.5% of our topsoil still every year in this country. We've lost 1/3 of our topsoil since 1970. There's a reason why, if you look at a Google Earth image of Great Britain, the sea is brown at certain times of year. I don't know if anyone's been to Brighton Pier or Blackpool Pier, but the sea is brown. It never used to be brown. It's brown because of poor agricultural practice and the soil simply being washed away whenever we harvest and whenever it rains. Well, you can't keep doing that. You're mining topsoil, and the next generation, or certainly the one after that, is going to find they don't have any soil left. So if we want abundant water and abundant soil and a long-term ability to produce food, we have to heal nature. We don't have a choice in the matter. My view is that really ambitious nature recovery goes hand in hand with food security. And we see that in places like South America. More than 50% of the arable farming now in South America is adopting no-till practices, permaculture practices, and so on. That's an enormous transition. The Midwest of America is undergoing a regenerative farming revolution at the moment. Huge changes taking place in the direction of soil regeneration, restoration, and rewilding. So, I think far from being mutually exclusive, I think they're absolutely mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, just to add very quickly, I think one of the other things that when people talk about food security, it's often to do with quantity and not quality. And I think one of the really important things is to look at nutrition. It's not just the volume of food that we're able to grow, it's also what type of food. And we can't feed the whole world with only wild foraged food, but it can bring a huge part of the nutrition to one's diet. And then I know it's kind of, a lot of people talk about meat as well, but really growing the quantity of grain we do for, meat-based diets, it doesn't work. The equation doesn't add up. And I think, the more we can grow highly nutritious, organic food, the less of it we actually need to eat.
The gentleman in the green shirt? I can't really see that well. And then we'll go over here on the right.
Ben, you were sort of talking about the subsidies for environmental benefits. One of the disadvantages is that most of those benefits or options available are for the sort of the larger arable farms, and the small grassland farms, there are very few options available.
I mean, I'm not sure that's going to be the case. I feel that the scheme has been designed in such a way as to be progressive, whereby the bigger farmers who are more likely to be profitable will actually have fewer options open to them. So things like exploring no-till and innovating around integrated pest management and things, there will be rewards for those. But the really generous payments are going to come for example, helping to reduce flooding by changing the way you graze steep slopes, or there'll be ambitious nature recovery grants under the third tier for places like Dartmoor and Exmoor in reward for sort of radical nature recovery. And it has actually been designed whereby acre for acre, the less likely you are to be profitable, the more money there will be available to you from doing other things. And also bear in mind there's a bunch of private markets popping up alongside the new scheme, the most established of which is in Poole, not far from here. There's a bright spark within Wessex Water pointed out to the senior management that rather than spending £1 billion on a new water treatment plant to clean phosphates and nitrates out of the water, why didn't they simply pay farmers further up the catchment not to use nitrates and phosphates? And a market emerged which goes under the title Entrade, E-N-T-R-A-D-E, if you want to look it up, whereby Wessex Water is paying tens of millions of pounds now to several hundred farmers for protecting the steeper slopes and significantly reducing phosphates and nitrates going onto the land. And then the Environment Agency said, well, actually, those very same farmers can help us reduce flooding in the town, and we'll pay a little bit too. And on an acre-for-acre basis, farmers in the pool catchment are receiving way more in money from those schemes than they were receiving under the old Common Agricultural Policy. And there are now 12 what they call stock exchanges popping up around the country for different services in different places. So alongside the new public money for public goods scheme, I think there will be a multi-billion-pound market for these kinds of environmental services. So if you're a farmer in a sensitive part of the catchment, let's say in a floodplain, or in the steep-sided valley in the Lake District, there's going to be a lot of money available for restoring the healthy functioning of that land, from both water companies, insurance companies, Environment Agency, and the main government public money for public goods scheme. And I think people will be pleasantly surprised. I think those in the more marginal landscapes will find that the future is a lot brighter than they think it's going to be, and perhaps a lot brighter than the past, or the recent past has been.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, what do you want to ask? You've got a spare mic?
Oh, some of the fundamentals that go with it, all of this that you've been talking about, how can you get the government and politicians to wake up, to know what's going on, what matters, what's not working, what to do about it, instead of just being concerned about growth and profit. And the education system, so students from the earliest age, they're able to take these things on board, should be learning about healthy diets and how crops are grown and what the effects are on the environment and all of that. I don't think that's really part of the education system. And what about all the waste, all the plastic, all the containers, all the things that food winds up being wrapped in to go on the market? What to do about that stuff?
I can answer the plastic one, and perhaps I'm going to pass to you. So this year there was a discovery that mushrooms actually have evolved to eat plastic, because mushrooms are able to pull apart compounds, and I think something was going to evolve to do something about plastic, because there's just so much of it. But I think it was in Asia that a bin was found, and mushrooms had infiltrated this bin and had actually within 3 days restored it to its original compounds. So I know that work is, it's incredible. And so now that work is really being intensively worked on by a whole team of scientists, including, all over the world, in how to harness this mushroom in order to deal with some of the plastic in the ocean at the moment, and some of the huge plastic rubbish heaps. So that is an exciting bit of work that is being done at the moment that has naturally occurred. No one was actually trying to make that happen. And then, do you want to speak on education?
Yeah, I just completely agree with what you said about education and the need to, embed a connection with nature and make that possible. So I just wanted to give you 2 examples from what Snow Change do, but also there are multiple examples from across the network of partners that we work with of trying to do this. Literally wherever you go, I've heard the same things in Wales, in Finland, in Kenya, in Uganda, in the Philippines. The thing that rural communities are most concerned about is that their young people do not want to stay. And there are some elements of the rewilding movement who think that's actually a good thing, because they think rural depopulation will open up land. Whereas actually I think, hopefully what we've said today is it doesn't mean having no people. Rewilding is not about a landscape without people, and wilderness isn't about not having people on the land. So in two instances from the Snow Change Network, one in Selkie itself, they've written as part of this bigger sort of rewilding project a traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge part of the curriculum. So as part of everything they do, the kids learn, and they have elders from the community coming in, fisher people, gatherers, hunters. They also participate in those activities as part of the community, and they have a kind of seasonal round of those activities. There's a forest behind the school which has been purchased for the school, in which they go out and do lessons. So both the formal things that they're learning and the space that they're in, they're constantly having opportunities to embed their learning in specifically the place that they are from and that their parents and grandparents and presumably ancestors hope that they will stay in. Another very amazing scheme in quite a repressive context is in Russia, where nomadic reindeer herding communities, their children are required to undertake state education. And so what Snowchurch has done there is supported them to attach to their reindeer caravans small-scale solar, which allows the children to travel with their family groups all year round and complete their work online, so that they can be out, wrangling reindeer with their mum and dad all day, and then come back and do their maths in the evening with a light and with a whatever they need to do that. So I think there's immense creativity, and it doesn't take very much to do these things. But then, as you say, I don't think I'm perhaps the best person to speak to how to convince government to do things. But yes, there are spots of light in the work that I've seen.
This man on the left.
Specifically, I think for Ben this morning, around nature-based solutions. NBS is like prairie land in Russia, the steppes, and prairie land in America has maybe 7 to 8 tons of carbon per hectare, and the farmed land that's been left fallow has had maybe 40 to 50 tons per hectare. So there's a great example of the land being able to soak up masses of carbon, and maybe I know there are many innovative ways of actually looking at finding extra funding for farmers for extra income streams to be able to take farming out of intensive agriculture and specifically into rewilding and regeneration in order to create nature-based solutions for climate.
I mean, the coast and the inshore marine environment is even more amazing. An acre of seagrass absorbs each year more carbon by tenfold than an acre of the Amazon, and yet we've destroyed 98% of our seagrass, and it can't grow back because we trawl the seabed, and the seagrass seedlings can't grow. So restoring seagrass around the British Isles would be a pretty amazing thing to do from the perspective of absorbing carbon. The coastal salt marshes absorb massive amounts of carbon if you give them the chance. And I think there's a huge opportunity for nature to provide a big part of the answer. That there was a mini ice age that affected the Northern Hemisphere between 1650 and 1850. In fact, for 200 years, there was a fair on the Thames every single winter, with fairground rides and so on. It lasted all winter. The last time it happened was in 1848, and the winters were brutal in the Northern Hemisphere for those 200 years. Well, scientists believe now that the reason for that mini ice age was because of the European diseases which wiped out many of the Native Americans of South, Central and North America. There were 50 million people on those continents when we arrived, and there were just about 1 million or 1.5 million by the end of Queen Victoria's reign. Many of them weren't killed by the sword. They were killed by yellow fever, by the common cold, by influenza. And the death of those tens of millions of Native Americans brought about land abandonment and an enormous regrowth of forests through the Amazon, through Mesoamerica and up the eastern seaboard, Appalachia. Vast numbers of trees, vast amounts of carbon drawn very quickly out the atmosphere. So what that shows us is that if we restore nature, if we restore the seagrass meadows and the coastal salt marshes, and we switch to no-till arable farming, and we allow trees to grow back in the mountains, and we do all the different things that we can do to restore nature, nature will absorb a vast quantity of the carbon that we've emitted and will be a big part of the answer. And I think that we won't fix the climate problem unless we do that. Decarbonising our economies won't be enough. Now, I'm quite optimistic that we will decarbonise. This country, United Kingdom, I read recently, the economy has grown 80% since 1990, and our emissions have been cut by 46% during the same period. So we are capable of doing it, and I think renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil fuels. Electrified. I came here in an electric car today, which sometimes works. I once got locked in Thruxton Airport overnight because I tried to charge it there, and they locked me in. But it does generally work, and soon they'll be cheaper. And I think that we will get to a zero carbon situation with our kind of with our own human environment. But simultaneously, we've got to heal nature. Otherwise, it won't be good enough. It won't be enough.
Sorry, just to quickly add, because I think that I have a little concern about how the nature-based solutions narrative is unfolding and how it's been embraced by some of the biggest polluters in the world. There's the amount of land that has been already bought up for offsets of some kind or another is larger than the land base of the Earth, because economics is not logical. And so when it's a question of what these nature-based solutions are for and where the finance is coming from for them. Because if that decarbonisation of the economy won't happen if that only happens in a capitalist market for carbon offsets. And at the same time, although I had this conversation with a trade envoy for the UK at one of the recent COPs, it was possibly the one in Paris, the big success one, supposedly, where he said a similar stat to me there. And unfortunately, the wealthy nations have largely achieved what seems to be or looks like a decoupling of energy and material intensity from GDP growth through offshoring and creative economics in terms of how much they accept as their emissions. So I think that, I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert on these things, but I think there's at the very least a cause for concern at how this calculus is being done and how well we are actually doing. And that language around nature-based solutions, like literally every industry in the world now is greening itself using this language. And there are genuine attempts, and there's also a lot of nonsense. And so, yeah, I just think there's a need for, if we're going to get involved in the political debate, there's a need for caution.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think if we can't use one as an excuse for not doing the other, is really the point. And I think there are oil companies that think they can continue business as usual as long as they plant lots of trees. And that's absolutely not going to cut it. We have to do both. So we have to decarbonise to zero as quickly as we possibly can. And simultaneously, we have to restore ecosystems on a grand scale. Yeah, completely agree. And Mark Carney, who's, I'm told, a very good man, the former president or chairman or whatever they call it of the Bank of England, is now devoting himself to figuring out what these rules might be. So one of the suggestions, for example, in terms of private companies participating in the re-greening of the world, is that they may only do so to offset emissions that have already happened. And that surely is a good thing. So Microsoft, for example, has said that they're aiming for net zero, but in the process they will also offset emissions going back to when the company was founded in 1977. So that may be one way, but absolutely we have to do both.
So one last question, this lady's been waiting for a while. It's might turn that into a couple of questions, but what I'm hearing, which is exciting, is a respect for the inordinate complexity of nature and the relationships between all of the species of plants and animals that exist on this earth. I worry in terms of climate change, suggestions of dumping iron filings or iron in some form into the sea to counter climate change, that there's powerful forces that may not respect that complexity in the same way as some of us do, and I don't know how we counter that. And also what I hear is in this room tonight, discussion and acknowledgement about the crucial importance of our connection to nature in a very real and palpable fashion and to each other. But what I see with 4 relatively young children growing up in the world that I'm in is also incredibly powerful forces that promote lack of connection and more time indoors, on screens, artificial intelligence, ways of allowing the future Earth to work that avoids real human and nature connection, and people going to other planets to find solutions rather than looking for the solutions here. So there's about 5 questions in there as to how do we, I obviously think that the answers are in this room in terms of rewilding, reconnecting with where we came from and what we belong to and what we're intimately interconnected with. But there are very powerful other forces that don't see it that way, and how do we make sure that our voices are heard to the same level?
I'll speak to you as a parent, because, as I said, my daughter was born in the community, and now we kind of have some more degree of modern lifestyle. And I was actually sat talking with Rob, one of the guys we work with, about what it means to be raising young people in this day and age, and how powerful things like the internet and how powerful screens are, and what a big role screens and social media seem to be playing in our children's lives. And I don't pretend to have the answer, but as a parent who has seen teenagers grow up in a community and also has connections with Indigenous communities, I think it's really important that, yes, there's education in terms of how the government is giving subsidies, for example, and how and land stewardship and all of these things, and that's kind of like bottom down, right? But there's also a lot of work that you could, and I don't like these words top and bottom, but for the sake of simplicity, there's a lot of grassroots challenging that I think needs to be done, whether it's as a parent. For example, in lockdown, I was noticing that I was being asked as a parent to have my child on a screen for 6 hours a day. And there was no thought to the psychological impact of that, and how test results were being put above children's mental health in a pandemic. And so my feedback to the school was, did you think about encouraging the children to go and sit in the garden and write 20 things that they saw that day or appreciated that day down? And I think unless we're challenging at every level, unless we're doing that work ourselves of reconnection, and as much as we can, because we all have our own limitations and abilities, and challenging at every level where we feel we can have influence, then I think these are the parts that we can all play as a society, because it's all very well to say we need more green spaces, but if as a community we're not saying we need a green space, there's 100 people in this room and there's no community garden in Frome, potentially, I'm not 100% sure, but I haven't seen, do you know what I mean? Then unless people are actually saying, well, this is what we need, and food, access to good quality food needs to be distributed and we need to produce that food, then there's an argument that why would that be a possibility within the current structure, So I think it's a case of being challenging, basically, because the system is not created. Sadly, the system is not created for our personal well-being. It's to drive an economic model. And so we have to recreate, because we are human beings, we created the system in the first place, and we can undo it.
Just to add to that, to speak to the question of power, what we feed grows and what we starve shrinks. And, for me, the biggest thing is really around localization, that when we create a local economy and at the heart of that a local food system, we depend less and less on the power, on the big globalized system, and we support more local, we're more engaged, we build community, we build connection with people, we build connection with where our food comes from. and we build connection with ourselves. We eat in season, we understand the seasons, and we celebrate them as well. And for me, that's the biggest thing. How can we create a local food system? We're not shipping food around the world. We're not shipping water, which is essentially most of what we ship around the world when we talk about food, whether it's in the form of fruit or meat or dairy. It's high water content. That means packaging, refrigeration, logistics. The more local we are, the less we need, and the less we put power into the big globalized economy.
I just wanted to share two thoughts. On the first thing you said about raising children, I'm not a father, but there's an amazing story in here, I think it's in here, or the other one, from Yellowknife in the Northern Territories of Canada. It's people who live there called the Kikisa Dene, and they've had to, they've dealt with all of the things that colonised peoples have had to deal with in North America, but they're also now dealing with climate change, and in response to climate change, they've done something they've never done before, which is they've started gardening. It takes like 16 hours to truck food there from somewhere where it can actually be grown, and it's so expensive and rubbish by the time it gets there that they said, well, actually the climate is warmer now, and they've started growing food, as well as hunting and fishing, which is their traditional life ways. And with this has come a new cultural aphorism, which is, today we have to be strong like two people. And that especially is something that they refer to their youth. And I think that speaks to a very wise thing, which is that we live in the world that we live in, and we have to start from where we are. And so the skills of discernment, we can't, if we extricate ourselves, that is to a greater or lesser extent, it's a false dichotomy that we're setting up. And I think that's really important. But that is a first step on a journey. And to your bigger point on essentially power, I think that if we were to be able to visualize these things, we can visualize the concentration of power, and therefore the concentration and narrowing ideas of what nature is, what it is for, what land is, what it is for, what water is, what it is for, with the predicament we find ourselves in. And so whatever you choose to organize around, wherever you choose to find community, there's two ways of looking at that. You can say, oh, well, we got together and we restored these salmon redds in an Arctic river. And that's a nice thing to do because now the salmon can spawn there, and it's good because of that. But it's also potentially a radical political collective action, because you are completely dismissing the value system that has held that system in thrall for hundreds of years. And in doing so, you build at least the base, the sort of the tinder for something much bigger. And at Gaia, we work according to what we call the principle of emergence, which is popularised by someone called Margaret Wheatley, who writes very accessibly on it. And she talks about how, in the same way that Earth is a self-regulating system, so are human societies. They're part of the Earth. And so when we begin to organise in these ways, and we start to see what we're doing as political action, whether it be planting a seed, restoring a river, or getting out in the streets, or hopefully doing all of those things, though we will find each other. And when we find each other, we get bigger and we start connecting. I'm privileged to work with people from all over the world who are resisting unwanted mining projects. And when that level of emergence happens, we gain a capacity that is beyond all of us as individual parts. And I think that we have been told so often to consider what can you do? Well, consider what we can do, and consider how you connect to that we would be my advice. There is no roadmap for where we are. This is an unprecedented moment in human history, and the clock is ticking, but that just makes that work more urgent.